Welcome everybody to the final day of the 2021 American Hop Convention. Coming to you live from Zoom. Appreciate everyone joining us this week, and it's been a really informative week. And we were just commenting before we hopped on here how so many of us have been able to capture more presentations and research information than in many years previously. So although this is a challenging year to do a hop convention not in person, there's definitely been some silver linings. With that said, on our final day here, of course, we're starting out this morning with our hop merchant panel, and this is a very anticipated session each year. I'm Blake Crosby. I'm with Crosby Hops in Oregon, and I'll be moderating our panel today. And on our panel, we have several of the key folks who market hops around the world, U.S. hops, and really have a clear and deep understanding of this marketplace. And I think this year especially, there'll be a lot of interesting things, perhaps more questions than answers. But with that said too, we're gonna leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. I also wanna make sure we recognize our sponsor. And needless to say, with this format this year, the sponsors we've had have been tremendously important. You know, as an HCA board member, when we were having conversations about this format, it was hard to say whether or not we might even be able to break even on this type of format, given that we had to make sort of a last minute adjustment to make this happen. As many of you know, we were supposed to be in Santa Rosa. So without further ado, I just want to especially thank HopTech by WeCo for sponsoring today's platform, and for also sponsoring this merchant panel, which, as I mentioned, is an important piece of the annual convention program that everyone looks forward to. So without further ado, I'm not going to do any formal bios, just in the interest of time. But real quick, I'll introduce the folks that have joined us here today. Alex Barth, CEO of John I. Haas. Alex and his family have been buying hops and marketing U.S. hops for a very, very long time, for many generations. And we're very happy to have Alex here today. We have Louis Gimbel, him and his family have also been buying and selling American hops for many generations, from Hop Steiner. We have Ryan Hopkins, the CEO of Yakima Cheap Hops. Ryan is the relative newcomer, but has made a big impact in a very short period of time in the hop industry. And in the last year was named CEO of Yakima Chief. We have Charles Matt from Charles Farm, UK-based supplier of hops, US hops and international imported hops, as well as brewing supplies based in the UK. I just want to thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today, and really look forward to a conversation. We're going to start with Alex and Ryan co-presenting. We're going to spend about half the time through a presentation, and then we'll have Q&A for the back half of the session. Again, I'm serving as moderator. I'm kind of playing a dual role, so I might chime in during Q&A a little bit, but I'll pretty much leave it to these guys. So without further ado, Alex and Ryan, take it away.
Excellent. So we're going to share our screen here. And here we go.
Great. Blake, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for everyone who's zooming in this morning. As you said, Blake, this is quite a tradition, the Hop Convention, and of course the Merchants Panel, something that people look forward to. And I think this is the first time that many of us will be alive and alert, as the end of a long convention can sometimes be a bit of a dusty hour at the final Friday of the convention. So as the new guy on this panel, Alex and I have worked together on a presentation. Alex, if you want to progress to that next slide, we have about 40 minutes of time here. I'm going to talk for the first 2 bullets. Alex is going to take on the second 2 bullets. And in the end, we'll transition with some discussion, which hopefully will invigorate some questions in everyone participating here today. as we then will have about 40 minutes, 45 minutes for Q&A. So hopefully we can invigorate some conversation and not just have 45 minutes of crickets on the world of Zoom. So thank you for making the time. One new tradition, as the new guy, I get one opportunity to create new tradition in this industry. Next year, somebody else will come into the industry and they'll make new traditions. This industry is amazing to me. Being new, I have a little bit of a new perspective. I've been a part of the hop industry for most of my life indirectly as being a Yakima Valley native person. But something new that I'd like to add to this merchants panel is just this time for everyone who joins us to reflect on some of the great heroes. And clearly we haven't captured everyone here. These 6 people, I wasn't able to find a photo of Julio Gomez, but these 6 people have made a significant impact on the industry, on our little industry, and they have passed since we last met down in Portland. None of these people passing were related to COVID. I think I don't want to create any rumors or anything like that, but these are historical members of our industry. And they have contributed in great ways. And I, as the new person to this group, wanted to start this tradition because we don't often get an opportunity to reflect on who has brought us here to the 65th U.S. Hop Convention. If I've missed somebody in that tribute, that was not intentional, and please send that forward. You can send that forward to the chat as I continue to talk through. As Alex said, I have 18 minutes. I want to stay focused on time and get to some other topics at hand. So in review, crop 2020. I want to advance to the next slide, Alex. 2020, in some context, is referred to as perfect vision. Looking back onto 2020 harvest, we would all probably agree that it wasn't perfect by any means. From spring to harvest, we all became really aware and quickly adapted to a whole new environment. We had things like social distancing, facial coverings, COVID testing, and the very foreign experience of going through a virtual harvest. I think when we all met in Portland last year, nobody would have ever thought that we would be still in a global pandemic. And yet, despite all these challenges, we have, like Blake said, we have some tremendous silver linings. We as an industry were able to operate. We are as an industry, and Alex is going to talk about this later about beer, we were determined essential and we could operate. But it's a true tribute to everyone on this call and the entire industry across the globe of the adaptability, the flexibility, the focus and dedication to bringing a crop in despite significant challenges. We all saw new health and safety requirements. We suddenly had to have hand washing stations within X number of feet from all of our workers. What I'm extremely proud of as the new guy is the way that this industry has adapted, the way that we took care of our people, and our people took care of the industry in order to bring in a tremendous crop. So reflectively, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about these challenges, and really a true, hopefully a dedication to some proud moments of us being able to bring in a crop despite many of these challenges. Next slide, Alex. But as we all know, 2020 was not the easiest crop. When Alex and I started talking about this presentation, we took an oath not to use the terms fire and brimstone, but it was a very challenging crop. September 8th, 2020, here in the Yakima Valley will always be remembered as one of the most impactful windstorms that we've ever seen. That picture on the left there is from Moxie. And that windstorm was powerful. It really created havoc on some of our crops, thrashed some of our fields, and created a different experience as if the harvest wasn't challenging enough. The picture on the right there is taken on December 24th of 2020, down in small crop in Motueka, New Zealand. And I think this is the last kind of downer slide that we'll have in this presentation, because we're all very happy that 2020 is behind us. And again, a reality and acknowledgement to the challenges that we had as we went through this harvest. These were not the only challenges. The 2020 crop throughout the Pacific Northwest, we saw some increase in hop stump viroids. We saw some challenges of some older fields, maybe not producing like we had anticipated, but all in all, we rallied around and we were able to produce and bring into the barns a crop, a meaningful crop. And like I said, Alex and I took the oath not to use the term fire and brimstone. So this slide doesn't talk about smoke and those associated challenges that we're all happy to be in our past, hopefully for a very, very long time. Next slide, Alex. So I've got a couple of slides here to talk about the last decade of what we've seen in the global hop market, in the hop industry. I'm going to start off really taking a review. My slides will be sourced on the bottom right there as you're viewing this. Most of them coming from the IHGC, some of them coming from the USDA. But this slide gives us a good reflection on where we've been for the past decade. Global hop production by acreage, and comparing that to production in pounds. So the green bar being volume, the blue line being acres. In the last decade, we've seen a really significant, in some ways, transformation. The transformation being at the start of the decade, we saw a decline. Acres globally were receding. Production was having some challenges. You can see 12 and 13, and then that blip in 15 with a really pretty significant change. 2013, we began to see a rise in acreage, and that rise has continued for the past 10 years across the globe. We here in the US have had a significant influence on that rise in acreage. And it's something that we should be mindful of as we, again, prepare not only to close a decade of the hop industry and enter into the future, but as we look 19 and 20 specifically, we all on this call, whether you're a brewer, a merchant, or a grower, now have influence on what 21, 22 through 2030 will be like. I think it's important to look at from a global perspective that 2020 bar is, we had some acres planned, and as we all sat at this merchants panel last year, we had most of the 2020 crop in discussion. When we all left Portland and went our separate ways, some of that changed. And we made some adjustments in March and spring, in our spring work, that influenced what the production actually occurred for the 2020 crop. So this slide hopefully creates some questions and some ideas in your mind about that gap there between acreage and production. These are published stats, but there was more to the story of that. Next slide, Alex. Scale. Scale is an important thing for us all, everyone on this call in the industry, the collective hop brewing industries to always keep in mind. This gives us a good breakout, the far upper left, US. Again, we're comparing pounds production to acres. Germany, Europe excluding Germany, and then the far right, our friends down south who are just getting ready to prepare for their harvest. What is always interesting is that the US and the Germany continue to compete or side by side bring in the vast majority of the acres and production of the crop globally every year. US continues to increase our acres. Germany slowly increases their acres, but production stays relatively steady in the US, while we have some production changes in Germany as well as in Europe. The Southern Hemisphere continues to rise and they get good crops, a little more volatility, but you can see the scale of it. We're talking about 5,500 acres. So just some scale, some thoughts. Again, this is a global market that we all work in. Next slide, Alex. More specifically, we also often have conversations about alpha versus aroma. And this slide here shows a dramatic change in the last decade of the influence of aroma acreage on the global hop supply. Something to be quite reflective of is the alpha volumes in acres. Alpha of acres is somewhat consistent, a dip down there in 14 and 15, but then beginning to increase. And the increase has been slower than, of course, that wild and dramatic increase in aroma. And I think this brings us to some discussions around we as the US hop industry truly influencing these numbers on a global scale. Next slide, Alex. Now this one gives a really good indication of the last decade. It's not only a transformation, like I said in my first slide, that transformation specifically to those on this call from a US hop grower's perspective. You can see in 2010, 19% of our crop was aroma based. And in 2020, 74% of our crop is teamed aroma. Again, these are IHGC numbers, and that those numbers could be debated, but what isn't debated is that Germany has stayed pretty steady in their focus and production of alpha, about half aroma, or just under half aroma, and the other portion of that being alpha. Whereas in the US, we have responded to this exciting increase in demand for high value aroma varieties. Next slide, Alex. And to dive into that a little more deeply, this here is by volume percent of the top 10 varieties in the US. It again shows a progression, evolution of the US hop volumes by percent over the past decade. It's an amazing story and an incredible story. You can see in 2010, 26.7% of the crop by volume was CTZ. This year, the volume that CTZ brought in was 16%. What's not shown in this is the acreage associated with that, and CTZ was only 11% by acres. The other amazing thing is that bottom bar showing Cascade, that bell curve of we're basically ending the decade slightly below the volume that was produced back in 2010, where a huge increase reaching its peak crescendo in 2014 with volume of Cascade, and now you can see that rapid decline. And vice versa, you can see some increases in some varieties, that pale caddis almost color of being now the largest crop by acres being Citra. This slide hopefully influences and sparks some good conversations and questions, but what from my perspective it does, it really demonstrates how agile and responsive the US crop has been. And all of us on this call being involved in the US crop have a tremendous influence on what the global crop will be. Of course, none of that will make any sense unless there's beer for all of these hops to go into. And that is the next portion that Alex is going to walk us through, diving deeper into what's happening in the brewing industry. And then we'll come back to some further discussion on what the potential outlook is for 2021. So I'll
Well,
hand over to you, Alex.
thank you, Ryan. As Ryan mentioned, our industry has been deemed essential. Beer has been deemed essential in most countries. And in the US, the Beer Institute was very instrumental to make sure that beer would remain essential. However, there's a number of countries in which beer was temporarily banned from being produced, or just general alcohol was being banned from produced. And if you look at some of these countries, Mexico, South Africa, India, Thailand, Peru, those total hectoliters that they would produce on an annual basis makes about 10% of the world's beer production. So for a couple of weeks or even months, about 10% of the world's beer production went actually offline. That was a big hit to our industry and a big hit to beer that requires hops. So what did 2020 look like? It just ended. We are getting data over the next weeks and months. But one way to look at estimating the volumes of 2020 is to really look at the top players of the beer industry. And this chart is a representation of the top 7 beer makers that actually make 2/3 of the volume produced in 2019. And so as you look at, for instance, AB InBev, which has a market share of about 29.3%, they reported in their first half year result that volumes went down by 14%, but that in Q3, they saw a better performance than it is typical in the third quarter. For Heineken, you're looking at the performance from Q1 through Q3, down -8%. So you look at various countries, various breweries, and you sort of get a sense of where the world brewing industry has come out in the volume of 2020. And if you look at what the volume was, it's really a response to how the various countries had worked with their pandemic and how many lockdowns occurred where. So for instance, in Europe, that makes up more than 450 million barrels, there were strict lockdowns, and there's also a large portion of on-premise business, which of course is the one area of the beer industry that's been most affected. North America lockdowns were not as severe as in Europe, and only in the US, you have 20% of total beer is really on-premise. And so you look at various countries, various regions, and you sort of get a sense also how these regions responded and how the overall production declined. So we at this point believe that the decline in total beer volume was about 8 to 10%, but you put that into some numbers here, we're talking about 130 to 160 million barrels produced less. This is a massive decline that hasn't happened in decades. So why the lockdowns? And this is a chart that looks at the mortality rates of various big markets like the United States, the European Union, Brazil. And you can really see that at the start in March and April of 2020, there was some pretty high death rates that came about. It didn't show up so much in the actual numbers of the cases of COVID tested positive cases, but it showed up very much in the mortality rates. And then as summer came about, lockdowns were eased, things went back to normal. But by fall, the mortality rates increased dramatically. As a matter of fact, they've increased to the point where they superseded the ones that we saw in the springtime. And that's why, again, lockdowns and severe restrictions were in place. And it is very likely that those restrictions will last all the way through January into February, and maybe even in some cases into March. But of course, lockdowns hit most the on-premise business because it's very difficult to only serve beer through a window to a person walking by on the street. So let's talk about on-premise versus off-premise. Around about a third of total beer volume around the world is really on-premise. But what's interesting is that about half of the value share of beer is on premise. So as countries needed to shut down, you had most impact on the on-premise business, which has proportionally the highest value. The US, for instance, as I said before, only has 20% of its overall beer volume as on-premise, but for craft, it's 40%. And that business has taken a big hit, and that's the highest margin business. So as you look at what the impact of the pandemic was, it was, yes, a volume impact, but much more so it was a value impact. And the restrictions essentially impacted brewers' profitability most. And of course, as they look to recovery, they're going to look for a lot of efficiencies in those recovery years as they rebuild their businesses. But of course, the disruption of closures had a couple of other impacts. So in the US, you had about 40 million barrels that had to move from one channel to another channel, but also from mostly keg to some other form of packaging. Most of the packaging, of course, went to bottles or cans. And in the quarterly report of Coors, they mentioned that they had to, they sold 300 million more cans in 2020 than they did in 2019 through the third quarter of the year. But I also mentioned that that required additional paperboard and other logistical challenges. So it was not just taking the beer from one channel to another channel, but it had a whole other host of issues that came along with it. So we have lack of can supply, you got lack of canning options, and a lot of times the distribution channels were strained, and that basically did not help many small craft brewers to pivot from the on-premise to more of the off-premise. But there's one other aspect that needs to be talked about as well, is that on-premise focused beers actually are sort of different beers because they were designed for immediate consumptions. And you could basically create some wonderful hop bombs that will be consumed within a week or two. But now, as you have to take that beer into a packaged product and then sell through a different channel, you cannot have that beer consumed within a week or two of being made, but that beer now needs to last about, several months, 3 months, 4 months. And so those certain hop bombs needed to be readjusted, and essentially you have to have either less hops or different hops in there. There's also the other aspect of our brewers continuing to evolve. And now I'm going to get to my favorite topic, which is basically the idea that the definition of beer in the US includes flavored malt beverages and hard seltzers. These products do not contain any hops, and therefore they are, in my view, not real beers, but it is the FMBs and hard seltzers that have grown to approximately 10% of today's total beer volume in the US, up from 7.5% in 2019. It is this category that really is responsible for offsetting declines in what I deem as real beer. Now, I grant you, I'm very biased. We do hops, and so FMB's hard seltzer for me is not necessarily beer, but it is counted as such. And it's of course responsible for the reason why the US only was down in its statistics by maybe a fractional percent. But the evolution of brewers continues as they invest in or also partner with other beverage makers. Molson Coors has essentially officially declared itself the Molson Coors Beverage Company. And that is great because ultimately it produces great opportunities to take hops into other beverages beyond beer. And so this could possibly become a gateway for our industry to find a place in other industries or other beverages. But I also want to point out a certain threat that as the door opens us to different beverages, that door swings the other way as well. And there's plenty of flavor providers from other industry who are looking to get into the beer industry. So this is looking at major trends. And I know most of you will have trained the eyes immediately on the top picture. That is essentially a clipping from the China Resources Brewery quarterly report that shows how the industry has changed dramatically, how the former mainstream beers have differentiated into multiple different beers, and particularly focused on the high end and super high end, so the premiumization. But if your eyes sort of continue to go down the screen, you will see that you might be looking at tomorrow's craft consumers or beer consumers, because ultimately the face of beer consumers is changing the world. On Tuesday, we heard that Latina, Asian, and Black females are the fastest growing segment in the alcohol business, and their demands will be heard. Their demands will be supported with dollars for different flavors, but also as different flavors, they might also be drinking less, which of course will continue in the decline of per capita beer consumption worldwide. So as the industry evolves, differentiates itself, continues with its premiumization, you will see different brands emerging, and particularly on the real beer flavor side, the differentiation so far has been very much through hops in mostly craft, but now is starting to also make its way into beers that is not necessarily considered craft, maybe some more mainstream beer or some better for you beers with higher flavors and flavors through hops. As we look at our customers directly and look at their behaviors, we're also going to see that in this current environment of uncertainty, the horizon of decision-making is shrinking, and particularly for forward contracting of hops. There's two basic uncertainties here. One is the volume, and two is the recipe. What is the variety choice that will be demanded tomorrow? So from a volume perspective, the industry as a world industry will likely take until 2023 to regain its pre-pandemic volumes, especially as the on-premise business has to regrow and rebuild itself. And a lot of brewers will probably take another look at how much they want to be only in one channel or two channels, and so rejigger their business with a lower risk model. But perhaps the more important aspect will be how consumers will pay with their dollars for what flavor choices tomorrow, or in 3 months, or a year from now. So as we talk about our consumers evolving and flavor choice being different, what will the choice of hops and hop varieties be in the future? What will the influence be of hard seltzers on beer taste? There's the cherry hard seltzers, there's the berry hard seltzers. So all these various flavors are emanating into what is typically also a beer consumer segment, and that will be a good question and a big question to look at in the future. So I now want to switch into a little bit of a historical perspective and look for some historical context of what we've gone through in this pandemic year of 2020. The first thing comes to mind are some real crises of the Great Depression and then more recently, the Great Recession. As you look at the headline news, you always see the Great Depression was ushered in October 29 with a demise of the stock market, which over about a 7 to 8 months period, basically lost about 80% of its value. You look at the Great Recession, which lost about a similar time horizon, about 40 to 50% of its value. And more recently, the 2020 pandemic, the stock market dropped by about 35%. So these are real indicators of fear, of tremendous change in outlook, but that's the stock market. That's the headline news. The real economy is a lot slower and it takes a lot longer. So let's take a look at the Great Depression. We've looked at beer volumes and world hop acres. And basically said one crop year serves the following calendar year for beer volumes. And so we looked at the numbers and indexed them with the pre-crisis year of, in this case, 1928, and said both the world hop acreage and the beer volume is 100%. And how did that evolve over time? So you see in 1929, beer volumes actually increased over the prior year. And so did the hop acreage. A year later, it declined, and it continued to decline over the next 3 years by as much as 23% from its peak. That is huge. Nearly a quarter of the total beer volume vanished in a matter of 3 years. But the hop acreage in the same time declined even more. And it didn't regain some momentum until year 5. And over that 4-year period, it lost nearly half of its acreage. That is significant. So the recovery lagged, the decline was more severe. As a matter of fact, it took until the 1970s for the world hop acreage to reach the same level until prior to the Great Depression. What's the reason? The Great Depression drove production efficiencies, higher yields, lower cost per unit, but also on the brewing side, they tweaked with the recipes and actually ushered in a time of lower and lower bitterness units over time. More recent, the Great Recession, same approach here, with 2006 brewing year being the 1 year pre the Great Recession sort of starting really and coming to full fruition in 2008. The interesting thing here is that beer volume over this time didn't really change too much. As a matter of fact, it still, in the whole, continued to grow. Some countries did suffer quite a bit, like Mexico went flat from a strongly increasing level before, or Russia just completely declined. But overall, the beer volume story was one of growth. What changed was the fact that a lot of breweries were under tremendous cost pressure. Remember, it's the financial crisis, and drove efficiencies. And so these efficiencies, they achieved by using higher efficient hop products, and ultimately from 1 year to another, reduced about 1,000 metric ton of alpha demand by changing recipes. So it was an adjustment that the industry had to make, because all of a sudden that same acreage produced more alpha than it needed, and it needed to be adjusted. Now, it took some time for that to trickle through, but by brewing year 2011 or crop year 2010, particularly the United States, made the hard decision and adjusted its acreage by as much as 25% down. The recovery ultimately took until the entire industry pivoted towards more flavor hops, and therefore it took until 2013-14 for the industry to recover from those acreage declines from the Great Recession. So that brings us to today. Again, we have here the pre-pandemic years of 2018 and 19, but also have a pandemic year where we are estimating the volumes to be down by 8 to 10%. Remember, crop 19 serves brewing year 20. Crop 19 was harvested, was grown on the basis that brewing year 2020 was going to be a normal year. Nobody had the idea that we're going to lose up to 10% of the volume. So from an acreage perspective, acres went up, but brewing year 2020 was much reduced. Brewing year 21 will be continued to be impacted by the pandemic. It will recover some, but not all of its volume. And again, it will take by 22 or 23 for all volumes to reach the pre-pandemic levels. But the hop industry itself, back when Ryan spoke to it in March, made some adjustments, but not much. Crop 20 serves brewing year 21. So ultimately, where are we in this total picture, and how will the industry now respond with its acreage in 2021 serving calendar 2022? This is a chart I've presented last year as well. I continued it on this year. This looks at total beer volume versus total hop production. A very simple way of saying I'm matching beer volumes with the corresponding crop year and hop volume over time. And while it is not an exact science, and you can see the line, the yellow line is pretty squiggly, it does over time approximate the right hopping rate that would exist across the world. So the dotted line is a trend line, which probably is pretty much accurate to what the real hopping rate is. And therefore you can actually look at individual years and say, if production exceeded what the hopping rate was or what the actual demand of hops was, you have a surplus. So above the line is excess supply, below the line is supply shortfall. And actually, if you look back over the last decade or so, it does match up quite nicely with what we truly experienced. So look at all the way to the right, and you look at COP 2020 or 2021 brewing year, you're seeing that a significant increase similar to that what we've seen in the late 2000s has reoccurred. So the hop industry, for the first time in a long time, is actually in an excess supply mode simply because total beer volume has declined significantly and unexpectedly. So I hand it back off to Ryan.
Alex, an incredible view and organization of the business that we're all in, working with brewers, and the importance of the ever importance of making sure that our supply chain is aware of what's happening in the beer industry, as we're all partners in this moving forward. We put this presentation together and started talking about this a few months ago. Alex handed me the great opportunity to give a precise prediction of what will happen in 2021. And although I may look young, I forgot my crystal ball, or it wasn't quite working. I don't know if the Wi-Fi was wrong. So the next slide is more of a question and an opportunity for everyone on this call and listening to this presentation, wherever you're listening from. I've been looking at the attendees. Looks like some people may still be sleeping, as we didn't get the record that we were looking for, but 215 people on this call. All of you have influence on what these numbers will be. 216, just speaking of it, more people are zooming in. Alex, that's good, that's good. So right now, the projections that we have organized or thought, the numbers that we see, it looks like Germany will be 33% of the total acreage. The discussions are that it will be flat-ish, potential small increases. The US is scheduled to be 40% of the total global acreage. It's incredible. And if right now the discussions out there in the farms and in hop polls still going into the ground, that there will be a slight increase in acreage for the 2021 crop. There's not just one question mark, but two, as I think we all need to be quite wise as growers and as brewers on how we look at that. The rest of the world appears to be 27%, the remaining of that piece of the pie of total acreage, and intends or expects to be flat. Between today, January 22nd, and when we all reconvene here next year, we'll know more clarity. As one of my great mentors in the industry, Steve Carpenter, likes to say, we will give a full and thorough update of the 2021 crop when everything is delivered and processed and sold. So I don't have an exact prediction. I apologize, Alex, but I would rather turn this to a question and start the discussion to the industry. As U.S. hop growers, we have a significant influence on the future and the next decade and the next generations of what this industry will look like. Many of you on the call, my friends and people who have also mentored me in this industry, are brewers who are also involved in the supply chain. And as Alex just gave a good thorough presentation to the business behind that, you also have an important influence on what this future will look like for a United States hop industry. And I think we all need to be wise about that, because we have the opportunity right now to determine where we will be sitting here a decade from now in 2030. The next quarter of this year will determine a lot of that and create some influence. So I guess as the new guy, I started a new tradition being reflective of the past, but also I'm going to take the bold statement and say we have an opportunity to influence where we're going forward. The next slide, Alex. There are some things we need to be aware of as influencers, as people in charge of a very important industry. There's a couple of things that we can't ignore that are in our future, and maybe they're landmines, maybe they're opportunities. Climate change, that event in September, that massive wind event, those things are real. And so things that we need to be aware of from a supply perspective on how we prepare ourselves for unforeseen weather events. It's been a while here in the US, and I don't want to be cautious to even mention the words, but we've had a great water supply. This year looks great as well, as the snow is falling in the mountains already, and we're looking pretty good, but that's something that we shouldn't take for granted. The labor industry, this is a topic that I think has been discussed and probably would be debated over several beers in the evenings at a normal hop convention. So please continue to stay aware, mindful, and active in what's happening in our labor laws, as we are a great industry who rely on a tremendous amount of people to train those hops, to twine those hops, and ultimately bring the harvest in. The biggest thing that I wanted to discuss is this EU MRLs. I was trying to get a shirt that said farm to fork. Well, it had a couple of explicits on it, and so no one would print my t-shirt. In 2019, the European Union launched the European Green Deal. The objective of that deal was to make the EU economy sustainable for the long term. It was the first true policy that would make Europe its first climate neutral continent by 2050. Part of that European Green Deal is the Farm to Fork strategy. This was released in May of 2020, so since we last met at a convention. The strategy of this Farm to Fork highlights that there is an urgent need to reduce dependency on pesticides and antimicrobials in order to increase organic farming, improve animal welfare, and reverse biodiversity loss. For those of you who don't know me, my background is in ecology, and I'm a believer in these things. But we need to be involved in this farm to fork process as hop growers, as people of agriculture, because this will influence where we move forward. The Farm to Fork program is not ill-intended. Those goals of creating biodiversity and increasing the carbon neutrality are things that we believe in as a institution, as a group. But if we're not mindful of it, could have really unintended impacts on how farming occurs. So I want to step off my small little soapbox here, because there's wiser people on this panel than I. But I do think it's really important that we take some focus on what's happening in this farm to fork strategy that's happening in Europe. Right now, about 50% of the US crop is exported. If we kind of think about that a little bit, I would guess that 30% of the US crop, it's a very conservative estimate, lands and is intended for Europe. And if we're not mindful, and if we don't have some influence on the EU farm to fork, that may be at risk. And again, Alex informed me not to be fire and brimstone, so I hope that all of you listening take this as motivation to be involved and to be active, because this is real. It will impact our MRLs, and it will impact this harvest moving forward. So with that, I'll leave a big, giant question mark for the panel and hand it back to Blake, so that more people can be heard of than just Alex and myself.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Alex. Wonderful presentation, very informative, and I think very thought-provoking. And I'm confident we'll have plenty of questions. So with that said, we're pretty much running right on time. So we have another 40 minutes or so. And it looks like I have one in the queue already. So I'm going to open that up. And like I said, we'll just throw this out to the group. And whoever chimes in, just remember to take your mic off mute. And we'll go from there. Okay, so how severe do you think the cost pressure on the brewer side will be as a consequence of the pandemic? Do you see more downstream products going into beer?
Well, I'll take that one, I guess. Good morning, everyone. Alex had the slide up showing what happened the last time we had an economic downturn, 2008 and the following years. And the question speaks to exactly what happened then. Brewers were squeezed, and that led to efficiencies in hops, and that we would expect a similar outcome this time around. Obviously, there was a lot of that 10 years ago. So, how much room is there to do that again? Well, you look at a lot of efficiencies that are possible besides just downstream products. And I think both Alex and Ryan alluded to that in their presentations, and really mentioned how, when you move away from a lot of on-premise production, you move into other war zones, the retail war zone, and have a lot of margin pressure. So that's going to, be reflected back on the hop industry.
Maybe I want to add something to that. What we saw in 2008 during the Great Recession was basically all focused on alpha. How much do you get to bitter beer? How much KGAs do you have to throw in the brew? And is there a faster conversion that you can do? The hop industry has, at least in the US, almost doubled since then. And our industry has been based mainly on, went from the alpha to the flavor category. But I also believe that as much as I love some of the hop bombs that use 6 pounds to 8 pounds of hops per barrel, it's really about getting that flavor into the beer. And as you overhop beer with, actually, I shouldn't use overhop because there's no overhopping period. But as you add so much pellet and in some cases raw volume into the beer, you lose so much. And it's not just costly from the hops perspective, it's very costly from the beer loss perspective. The industry has actually done quite a good job in looking at ways of putting flavor into beer without some of that loss of beer. So while in 2008, the cost pressures were really, how can I get my beer bittered more efficiently? when it was all about alpha, we may now see a cost pressure saying, how can I reduce the loss of beer and therefore save myself money? Because let's face it, hops, according to Bart Watson, was about $16 a barrel on the craft. The value of beer you're throwing away is a lot more. So every barrel has a potential revenue of $300 to $350 per barrel. So as you throw away the beer and beer loss, you're just losing a lot of money. So having products that actually save you money by putting in the same amount of flavor, but save you money by the reduced beer loss, actually is one way to improve overall margins. And that's something I think a lot of brewers, not just on craft brewers, but also a lot of the larger brewers who increasingly use flavor hops, which in their brewery setup are quite inefficient. When you got those mega brewing vats, I mean, you throw in hops and they sort of disappear. So they're actually less efficient on the bigger size than some of the smaller craft brewers. And cost pressures will be there because, as I said before, the loss of high margin on-premise volume means your overall brewery is getting a lot less gross margins in its house and therefore has to find ways of efficiency.
Very good. Any other comments on that question? Okay, next question. Can the group comment on the market long position on public varieties of the last few years and where you see that going in the next 5 years?
I can take a shot at that, Blake. I think it's an important question and something that is we need to be mindful of. Is it's not just public varieties or proprietary varieties. I think it's just an industry question on long volumes in general and the importance that we all work together and have focus on that kind of delicate supply and demand framework so that everyone involved can remain healthy and prosperous and moving forward into the future. There are likely public varieties that have a long position. There are likely proprietary varieties that have a long position. And I think the important aspect of it is that brewers and growers are working together in order to create some balance in that. What will happen is that, or traditionally what has happened is that those supply and demand, when there are imbalances, there's adjustments, and sometimes adjustments are in acres, sometimes adjustments are in price, sometimes adjustments are in finding new ways to use those products. What can be helpful and what is needed, whether it's a public or a private or a proprietary or I don't know what else other P I could use, is that there's intentionality around the communication between everyone involved. This industry is really small, but it expands out into brewers and growers across the globe. And so that for us as an industry or two industries working together, brewing and growing, to be very mindful about communicating well so that we don't get those imbalances. Otherwise, we will experience those ups and downs of supply and demand being off. So I don't know that it's necessarily a public variety problem. I think it's just an indication of hops in general. And as we all, as hop growers, continue to want to strive towards perfection in meeting our customers' demands, we have created more and more varieties. So there's more and more complexity to balancing that supply and demand. But I do have to say, I don't think it's just a public variety problem.
Blake, I might say something on that topic. I take Ryan's points and maybe would just add as we listen to these presentations and we think about supply in the market, as the market has differentiated and as the number of varieties have grown and brewers are using a larger range of varieties in a more specific and deliberate manner, it's maybe no longer as appropriate to think of the market in terms of supply of just alpha varieties and bitter varieties or public varieties and privately bred varieties, because we have such segmentation that you can have at the same time easily a market that's quite tight for one variety and in dramatic surplus for another variety. And the onus is on us as merchants and as growers and for the brewers to increasingly be conscious of the demand, supply demand situation for a given variety, which makes it quite a bit more complex and a little bit more difficult to stay on top of it for brewers than in the old days when, you know, basically you could get a kilogram of alpha price and engage the market on that basis. So
I think it's important to note for everyone that's joined in too that doesn't know Charlie, he comes from a unique perspective as well as being someone that has bought a lot of hops as a brewer. So I think that's interesting to note as well, and always appreciate your perspective, Charlie, knowing that you've been on both sides of the table with your time at Miller Coors over the years and others. So I think just for the benefit of everyone watching, I think that's an important thing to mention too.
Blake, I would like to just add something else. As we go forward with a broad variety portfolio, you have many different varieties, maybe 100 different varieties in the US. I mean, it used to be, you could count on 10, maybe 20. So as you have this incredible portfolio differentiation, you're going to invariably end up with a little too much of one, a little bit too little of another. I've talked about the differentiation and taste preferences and evolution of taste. With about 100 different varieties, and don't, you know, quote me on that 100, but a lot of different varieties. There's a little submarkets, and brewers are continuously trying to create new brands, new recipes, and have great aspirations of what this brand will do. Some will do great, others will be a flop. But you can't start a new brand without laying ahead and saying, I'm needing to secure some supply. And so there may be demand placed in the industry, which turns out to be false. By no fault of their own, the market didn't absorb that particular brand. But then there may be another brand that comes in that does surprisingly well, surprisingly better. And that'll generate certain demand. And as you've got this varied variety portfolio, you're invariably, I can guarantee you that we will be continuously long and short in a whole host of varieties. Not all hops are created equal, and not all hops will remain equal. Look at Cascade. That Cascade was, the obituary was written at about 3 times in my time in the industry. And I've been 30 years in this industry. It clusters. It was over, gone, until it came back. So we will see a resurgence. I mean, some varieties never die, others never grow. So particularly in this industry, which has embraced diversity, and that is really, really great. A diverse industry is the best way forward that continues to reinvigorate itself. You're going to have flops, and you're going to have runaway successes. But today's runaway success is no guarantee for the future. And we're actually very lucky in this industry that we're taking a very strong market approach in being amenable to change.
I'd just like to add, Alex, well said. You know, Ryan's last point there was all about the MRL issue, and you know that could really be a big driver to, which varieties succeed or fail going forward, because brewer may have a lot of preferences, but they may not be able to use something because of the increase in cost to grow something that's really affected by restrictions on the products you can use to help grow it. So, it's really, that's a really big thing for the future. And I think that yo-yo comment yesterday, Charlie, you made about Cascade, and Alex just made it, that's how it goes. And our job is to try and, at least, make the peaks and valleys not as severe.
I'm going to inject a question from me specifically on that note. And I'm thinking, as a merchant today and as a brewer, are you guys or should brewers be budgeting for a certain amount of hops that they may not end up using, given that complexity you mentioned, Alex? It's so hard to perfectly land where you need to land. Brands grow, then brands die, sometimes very quickly. You guys have any advice for whether you're a hop grower, hop merchant, or a brewer that's trying to manage a complex hop supply chain these days?
Well, one of the issues is really the length of the supply chain. And I think we've seen a big wake up on that during the pandemic because of the huge backlog at ports and things like that. And it's not just having to have a crystal ball about a variety and a new brand or an old brand. It's also about getting the product from the Pacific Northwest or from Europe to all the far reaches of the globe. And having certain inventory is important when you're trying to run that kind of complex portfolio of breweries and brands and hop products.
Maybe,
I'm sorry.
Charlie, go ahead, Charlie.
Blake, I might say something on that. I think it's a great question, and I think as Alex indicated, it may be difficult to ever get it exactly right. I mean, the difficult brewer space in actually forecasting their production volumes, and their consequent hop needs in an ever-changing environment, especially in the craft sector where the brewers are under pressure to produce something new and on a near daily basis. It's very difficult to end up at the end of the day without a little bit too much of something and a little bit too little of something else. But it speaks to the historic role of the merchant in some regards, and that merchants do have access through their relationships with multiple breweries to assist brewers in helping to balance out their inventories, and that's one of the roles that merchants have historically played in the industry. And I think that's important to note as well. But I also think that given the fact that hops are perishable, brewers need to have their accounting departments. I mean, we depreciate our older inventories as a company. So as hops age, and if you've got crop 15 or 16 in your brewery inventory, and it's still at whatever price that you purchased it at in 2015. Probably you should internally come to terms with the fact that those 2015 hops are not worth what you paid for originally, if you can sell them at all. And so I think some brewers are still not depreciating their inventories as they go along, and I think that's something that helps to absorb the loss over time in a way that makes it a bit more palatable when it comes time to actually throwing out hops, which does happen. So.
Maybe sort of expanding on that a little bit here, my biggest advice would be for brewers to have a very close communication with their supplier. And secondly, don't dwell on the past, look in the future. If you've got a hop that was great, but now is no longer needed in your various brands, don't dwell in the past and say, oh my God, what am I going to do with this particular hop? I can't destroy it. I paid so much for it. The first loss is the smallest loss. The longer you delay, the more it will be bad. So if you know something is gonna not be in your brewing formula, don't let yourself be hamstrung by, I have these hops, I need to find a home for it, because you're trying to sell beer that people will love today, not what beer they loved yesterday. So you wanna have the hops in the beer that people love today and tomorrow. And if you do that and say the past in the past, I make a clean cut, what is my option? You don't have that drag. Don't throw a hop into a beer that alters your taste. That's not gonna be what people really want now. And so the quicker you respond to the changing tastes, the quicker you talk to companies like ours. What can we do? We have, it's a term that I heard some years ago, juiced up some unloved aroma hops, extracted them, and actually put them into industry beyond the brewing industry, in the ethanol industry and stuff, something like that. Yeah, it wasn't the greatest use of money, but it didn't stop you from making the stuff that you're really gonna sell today. And so there are alternative routes for some unloved inventory that it hurts at the moment, but you're building the future, you're building the stuff that people are gonna drink today.
I've got one more perspective, Blake, if you don't mind.
Go ahead, Ryan.
It is complex, and the brewers have a big task to stay ahead of what the next product of demand is going to be so that they can be successful. The industry, the hop industry, is small. There's not a tremendous number of people involved who are growing these hops. As of today, 2020, we have in the Pacific Northwest 65 farms, family farms. And so I think it is really important also to recognize that something great about the US hop industry and about the US craft brewing industry, about beer in general, is that there is connectedness. Those 65 farms are active in these types of forums. They know what the market is. They understand what beer is going to be. And that is truly inspiring. It's not like that around the globe. Not every farmer knows the market like our growers do. And with that, it's a tremendous opportunity. It also creates some complexities on how things are moved. So I would say some potential solutions is to continue to stay active and be forward in your communication, like Alex said, because there are likely some solutions out there. This network between hop growers and beer is a very well-defined and growing market. In our pre-call yesterday, Charlie, you made a good observation that most people in the brewing industry are brand new. I think, Louis, you mentioned this as well, that this turnaround on who's making decisions at the brewing is increasing. And over the last decade, I think there's been a lot of newcomers to the industry. I've put myself into that category somewhat. And so it's important that if you are new to the industry, that you have to be mindful of the generations of these hop growers that some of these decisions might make. That there needs to be a commitment to, if you're long in hops, find a solution. And that solution, you have to have some onus in that, some responsibility. So what's inspiring about the US hop industry is that it's small and that the growers themselves are very active and aware. And I think that's inspiring, powerful, and has a good influence on the global crop.
I think that's a good comment, Ryan, and I think it's interesting to think of the generational backdrop you described, but juxtaposed to that, this wave of new perspectives and new brewers, and even in some cases new growers. And so I think that's really valuable, and I think it's important to remember that it's good to have fresh set of eyes on things as well. As we move forward here,
one last point, Blake, just on the same sort of related, is that we're one of the few industries that has the tool of long-term contracts to kind of work through all of this. And so many other industries It's day to day, it's week to week and year to year. So, having those contracts have given a lot of us the ability to make the big infrastructure investments, to remain committed to the business. And by the same token, it enables brewers to have certainty of supply. It enables us, as Ryan was saying, to talk about other years where some of these hops could be used better. And let's keep an eye on those contracts as that really important tool.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Lewis. I think that can often get lost in the discussion that contracting hops is still very important. I know the other day when Bart was presenting, we are seeing that contracting rate starting to go back up again, which is good. And I know we also hopefully have learned some lessons over the last several years of the importance of responsible contracting. So I think all that goes hand in hand. All right, so I'm going to go back to this concept of flavor. And I think this is a really interesting one to dig in here for a little bit. So I'll paraphrase this question, but for the group, where does hop oil play a role? What are suppliers doing to develop this space? And do you see flavor houses as a threat? So I'm thinking of other flavor compounds other than hops to this space. And what can we do to protect value in this space? I think that's 3 questions, but I think we understand the intent here.
Blake, why don't you start with a question or the answer, I mean.
Oh, you want me to take the answer? You first.
Okay. So of course, hop oils are the primary driver for flavor. And we, of course, as a company ourselves, but I think the entire industry has been focused on oils for quite some time, at least the last 5 to 10 years. There's more research being done. We have machines that take apart the oils to the nth degree, and you get this big paper with just a lot of wiggly lines that the scientists say that means something to them. I just look at them and say, okay, fine. But it is trying to understand flavor better. And we have just scratched the surface. We are looking at this broad spectrum of those multiple oils. You can identify the farnesene, you name the top oils and so forth. And they're just indicators almost. You're going to have some compounds that are small quantities with a big flavor impact and bigger compounds that have little impact. And then you can have the combination of the various oils. It's mind-boggling. But it is something the industry is diving into. And of course, I do see it has appeal beyond beer. And as I said before, as brewers become makers of beverages, not just restricted beer, they may take these products into the other products, into the other beverages. But I do believe that flavor houses who have spent their life dissecting flavor from all sorts of sources are very, very clearly targeting the brewing industry as the brewing industry expands the definition of beer. And it is both a threat and opportunity, as I said. You have these multi-billion-dollar companies with more researchers, PhDs employed than the entire hop industry has as people. So there's a tremendous power in these organizations that generate flavors out of whatever. And I know that certain brewers around the world have employed flavors from flavor companies. So we as an industry have to make sure that we don't remain on our laurels here, but continue to create and continue to develop products that find applicability not just in beer, but in beverages beyond.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Blake, I think Alex had a great answer to that. Efficiencies for the supply chain are really important, as we discussed earlier, and potentially hop oils could provide some of that efficiency on the brewing side. I will say that the hops are a very complex media. It's a very complex plant, and it provides flavors beyond just a specific oil, whether it be myrcene or farcene or linalool or whatever it might be. What is important and what we have seen in the U.S. over the past little while and now across the globe is that rise in telling a story. So the third part of that question was, are flavor houses a threat? And Alex said, maybe it's an opportunity, maybe it's not. But I think what we have seen is that there's this connection to where stuff comes from. As much as I wanted to have this wonderful shirt that said farm to fork, fork off, that connection to where things are grown is really critical. And I think it's very powerful. I think it's a story that we can't underestimate. And numerically, it's shown from just a success rate as craft beer. Is the consumer wants to know where their stuff comes from. And that's very intentional and powerful. And that's hard to tell that story if it comes out of a chemistry set.
I think the other thing I'm observing in the marketplace, which I think is exciting for hops, is hops have a really good reputation with consumers, it seems. Sounds funny to say that, but of course in beer, but even outside of beer, and I think hops are regarded as being safe, hops are regarded as being natural, hops aren't controversial like cannabis. And I think there's some interesting opportunities, as Alex noted, to look at these spaces and beverages outside of beer. And I know as an industry, we've always been searching for some diversity because by and large, most of our crop goes into beer. And perhaps this is something as an industry we can continue to look ahead to and create innovations that create even more white space for our little US hop industry. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to probably pick two more here that I think have been themes of the day. I'd be remiss if I didn't take one of these questions on the wildfire smoke, because I think that is important to address. It's been reported that the volume of hops from the 2020 crop that were damaged by smoke is over 300,000 pounds. In each of your experiences so far, are smoke damaged hops usable as pellets, extracts, or other forms? And I guess in other words, what is being done with hops that show signs of smoke damage? Not everyone at once.
I currently, everybody else lost their unmute button, Blake. Yeah, there's no question that smoke had an influence on the 2020 crop. What is unique to the 2020 crop in comparison to the 2017 crop, because there was quite a significant amount of smoke throughout the region in 2017 as well, is that the combination, I think, between some weather events, kind of a little bit of a perfect storm, if you will, smoke did have some influence on hops, and that smoke aroma and characteristics stayed into volumes of hops this year. It's been great because there's actually been, I haven't been able to attend a lot of this convention, but there are two posters that speak probably much more educated to this topic than I could here on this panel. So I would encourage people to look at those poster presentations that were presented earlier in the week. Smoke has impacted some volumes. I can just speak from my experience with that, as we've been working with growers to find solutions to that, and it's ongoing. We did a very intensive 100-day study to answer some of those questions, Blake, and we've come to some thoughts on it. It's a unique situation, but it is something that we should be aware of in the future, as these smoke events do become less rare, unfortunately, and need to be on the topic of all of our minds as we move forward into the future.
maybe some commentary from mine. So we, of course, look at very carefully at each of the lots coming through, making sure that there's no smoke that gets into the product, doing a lot of Bruin trials, sensory trials to make sure that the product remains perfectly usable, has the right flavor profile as the variety would expect. But we're also working very hard on trying to chemically understand what is smoke, what is not smoke, because it's something that, you know, can I smell it or can you smell it? And different noses smell things differently. So getting to a process where we can actually identify on an analytical basis what is smoke and what is not smoke, that is going to be a great help, because we can also then advise growers saying, okay, do you harvest during a heavy smoke period or do you go with something else? It's really depending on also the use of the hops that was intended. But ultimately, we're at the beginning of all the research, and I'm hoping we won't have much more, but we need to be prepared for the next event. As climate change does progress, and these will be certain things for us in the future that we will have to be prepared for.
Great. Well, we have about 4 minutes left, and I recognize we're not going to get to all the questions, but I'm skipping around to some of the ones I think are most intriguing for the purpose of this group. And this one just came in a second ago. What about the threat of GM yeast? So genetically modified yeast. I just brewed a beer with 0.1 pounds per barrel Cascade. It has the flavor and aroma of a guava orchard because the yeast amplified enzymes that released bound thiols present in malt. To put that in layman terms, genetically modified yeast apparently has the potential to unlock new flavors in a beer while using a lot less hops. Is that a threat to the hop industry? My initial thought is consumer trends are probably pushing against GM in craft, but I'm curious what you guys think.
I guess I'll use one of the phrases Alex referred to, said earlier about the gaggle of scientists that are constantly, you know, saying things to us on the management level. And, you know, that this sounds like one of those things that, you know, comes up. And I would agree with you, Blake. I mean, Ryan was just talking about authenticity, and that's, you know, not just important in craft, it's important everywhere. And because of the consumer, that's the value of the consumer, the trust the consumer has in what they're consuming, what they're drinking in our case. And, you know, so GM yeast is something that I don't know anything about, but it just sounds like another wrinkle that brewers may have to walk away from in light of authenticity, in light of the whole MRL discussion we had earlier. You know, a lot of times we do get these kind of QC questions about a problem in a beer, and it must be the hops. And then it turns out it's something entirely different. And, you know, as Alex said, you know, we have this kind of technical capability to look at the beers and the products to find this out. We have to. In some ways, it's a defensive move on our part, but, you know, to look at what happens and be able to, you know, confirm that it wasn't the hops. So that's an important part of our industry.
As much as I hate to admit it, hops aren't the only component in beer that provide flavor. And so I have to concede that yeast actually does have an impact on flavor. And I've heard a number of times these GMO yeasts could provide some hoppy flavors by, as you said, Blake, by amplifying certain flavors from the malt side. But I don't believe yeast can generate the complexity that a nice hop recipe can provide you. They can provide some of that, but not that depth and oomph that hops can give you. And then also, hops have other functionalities in terms of microbial control, foam enhancement, etc., that if you're just using yeast, you won't get that. You won't get all the benefits from yeast. Now, that is not to say that some of the yeast can be some partial displacement or small displacement of hops, but I do not see our industry being displaced by GMO yeast because the lack of complexity and other functionality from hops.
Okay, well, we're up on our time. Any parting thoughts before we wrap up? Well, I want to thank everyone for committing to this, and Ryan and Alex, especially for putting the wonderful presentation together. That was very informative, and I appreciate all of our participants as well. Also our sponsor, HopTech by WECO. And I do have a quick note before we go into our break. We will have our Cascade Cup here coming up in a few minutes at 10 o'clock, or excuse me, 9:45 to 10 o'clock. And before we end the day, since this is the last day of the convention and we can't be together this year, we wanted to close things out on a fun note. So we'll end the day with a statement from outgoing HGA President, yours truly, and order the hop nominations and other announcements. And then we'd like everyone to join together for a group cheers. So have a beer handy today at 1 p.m. Pacific. All right, well, thank you everybody, and hopefully we'll see everyone back here in 15 minutes.